You are listening to Germantown Community Radio, WRGU 92.9 FM. Welcome to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show, a weekly radio program that spotlights positive real estate development and neighborhood revitalization throughout Philadelphia. I'm your host, Derek Hengemil. Jumpstart Philly is a unique community development program that trains, mentors, networks, and provides funding to aspiring real estate developers in 7 different Philadelphia neighborhoods, including Germantown, where the program was founded. Jumpstart believes that you can do well by doing good and focuses on removing neighborhood blight, scattered site rehab, creating a healthy mix of affordable and market rate housing, and avoiding gentrification through slow, steady growth and keeping wealth local. Interviews are conducted during Jumpstart Germantown's weekly Jumpinar series, held on Monday nights at 7 p.m. with Zoom webinar. For more information about these events, check out the events page at jumpstartgermantown.com/events. This week, I'm speaking with Rob Luciani, who works for the Office of Property Assessment, also called OPA, about what the assessed value of your home means and what the appeals and abatement process looks like. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and be sure to check out the podcast version of this program at jumpstartgermantown.com/media. So I want to introduce Rob Luciani, and he is a PA State Board certified real estate appraiser and assessor, and he works for the Philadelphia Office of Property Assessment, OPA, and he holds the positions of training supervisor and deputy assessor. He's also an adjunct professor at Temple University Real Estate Institute and the Community College of Philadelphia's real estate department. So we're happy to have him here tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. How's it going, Rob?
Good, Derek. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks so much. So why don't we just start things off? I'll let you introduce yourself beyond what I already said. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, you got it. And by the way, I want to welcome everyone on the webinar tonight. And hopefully you'll find this interesting, rewarding, beneficial, and all those things. But Derek, you pretty much said it. I think let's get into the meat and potatoes. It's not so much about me. It's about what I can provide to the folks.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so why don't we with what the OPA is, the Office of Property Assessment, because a lot of us probably just know that as an initial, and it might be a department in the cities. So what does it do?
So you have to understand that it's actually Pennsylvania state constitutional law says that every county has to establish an office, a department, an agency within the county government to assess, which is just the same way as saying appraise or value all parcels within that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So this isn't anything that the city is unique to the city. It's every county in our state.
Right.
And it's constitutional law. And so what the OPA does is attempt to put a market value on every parcel of real estate within the city of Philadelphia.
Right. And how is that different than, just a random appraiser coming up with value or like in the private side of things, getting that done?
Yeah. So in theory, it's not different. Mm-hmm. In application, it's different. Right. So the way it works, being both a certified appraiser and a certified assessor, I know both sides of the fence. As an appraiser, we tend to look at one individual property at a time. We get an assignment to appraise a particular property, whatever it is. It could be a row house or a warehouse. And we look at that property and we go through the process of appraising it. As an assessor, that's not practical to do that because the city, as I mentioned to you in one of our conversations, we have approximately 589,000 parcels of real estate. Mm-hmm. So in order to look at each one individually, we would probably need about 5,000 assessors. Okay. And it would take about a year. All right.
Right.
So it's done on what's known as a mass appraisal method.
Right.
So we look at groups of properties.
Right. And it's interesting to hear there's the distinction between appraiser and assessor, because probably a lot of people hear those words and think the same thing. But it sounds like there's a different methodology behind it, and you should be using them appropriately, right?
There's a different methodology, but the end result is the same. We're both trying to determine as they say, quote unquote, the fair market value of a piece of real estate.
Gotcha. So how many properties are within the city's database?
About 589,000, I think I just mentioned.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. Okay. And those are empty lots or properties or?
No. Every legal parcel that exists in the city, from a row house to a warehouse to an office building to a property with a garage on it to a vacant lot to multiple acres.
Right.
If it's identified as a parcel and it has a parcel number, an APN number, as it were, tax ID number, it's known by a couple different things, but it's that, a 9 to 11 digit number, then it's a parcel.
Right. And will that APN number ever change? Does it remain the same throughout the life?
It can change if the classification of the property changes. So OPA is very departmentalized. And so, for example, we have a certain series of parcel numbers specifically for what we call mixed use properties. Okay. And so if a property is mixed use, it's going to have a certain OPA number. It's not really important for folks to understand that, but they're 871 and going forward. Apartment buildings are 888. Okay. Commercial retail properties are 882. But that's not important. What's important is we compartmentalize them. So if a particular mixed use property were to be converted to, say, apartments or purely single family residential, the APN number would change.
Gotcha. Okay.
Cool. It would be a different classification of property. That's how we track how to value it, because we're going to value a mixed use property different than a single family residence.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So just going back a little bit to what we were saying about the purpose of the office property assessment, you mentioned tax, like it has a kind of bond with the taxing system of real estate in the city. What other groups of people are using that number? Obviously homeowners to look up their tax or to look up their, tax balance, or developers. Are there other city departments that are looking at that assessed value for any purpose?
Yeah, Department of Revenue.
To take stock.
So we at the OPA, we establish the market value, fair market value, and then the Department of Revenue applies the tax rate, which is set by the city council. Based on budgetary needs.
Right.
And so we are not the tax man, and I'm not saying that to try to, get out from under any questions, but we deal in market values of real estate.
Right.
And then and it's a system, it's an old Latin, it's called ad valorem, which simply means everybody's taxed based on their value. So if your property is worth a lot of money, you're going to pay more tax than a property that's not worth as much money. But the millage, the rate is the same. Right now, it's currently 1.39%. That could change.
Okay. So as a developer, we have a call of 20 something or now 30 developers in the call. What do they like? When are they going to encounter the OPA in their, in the process of developing a home or that refinancing? Where does it really come into play for them, and why should it? What do they need to know about it specifically?
Well, of course, every parcel is going to have a market value assigned to it. So they might want to reassure themselves that that market value is accurate, because it's a big city and values can change in volatile markets like we have now. They could change monthly. So the OPA could have put a value on a property 6 months ago, and I'll be the first to admit maybe it's not accurate anymore.
Right.
So it's up to the taxpayer, property owner, as it were, to look at that number and determine whether or not they believe, based on evidence, market evidence, I should say, that they believe that number is not correct. Now, if the number is low, we're not going to hear from you. We get that. Okay. If your property is under, we never hear from anybody that says, by the way, you have my property assessed too low. Would you bring it up a little bit? We're not hearing that. Okay. And that's okay. I get that.
Right. So how up to date are those values? Or like you mentioned that they might not, I'm sure they can't, you're not assessing every single property in the city month by month. What is the average, relevancy to that they're
at best, they're a year old.
Okay.
At worst, they're 3 years old.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're never going to know the true day of market value of that home. It's a bit of a larger scale, it sounds like.
Yes. And if the market is stable, it doesn't really matter, because if we establish a value now, and let's say hypothetically we were in a stable market, that value could be valid for a year.
Right.
However, we haven't had a stable market since before the pandemic.
Right. So there's So there's a very real chance that you could check the assessed value that's on Atlas. You go to atlas.com, type in your address, you see the assessed value, and then you check the next day, it could shoot up $60K.
No, that's not going to happen.
Okay, all right.
I hope I didn't give you that impression.
Sure, yeah.
That's not going to happen. That may happen at best once a year, and at worst every 3 years.
Okay.
Because the city is always in the process of modeling and collecting and analyzing sales data on a monthly basis. And then that process sometimes takes a year, sometimes two. Like, for example, for a while there, we were on a cycle where 1 year we would reassess all the residential properties, and the following year we'd reassess all the commercial properties. And so that year in between, one of those categories was left behind. Okay. And so it's more than likely that the value will be, if it's a stable market, there's no issue. If it's a volatile market, the value probably will no longer be accurate.
Okay, gotcha. And so I just want to go back to the difference between like appraised and assessed value. Say you get an appraisal on a home, or you're looking at a home and you hear somebody says the appraised value of that home, and then you go online and you check the assessed value, and they're quite different. Because I know that happens a lot, and even just in my frame of reference, whether it be they're out of date or for whatever reason it may be. What does that distinction mean, and how should like a developer react to that?
Most likely the reason that would occur is two reasons. Number one, because the assessed value is probably a lot older than the appraised value, because the assessed value is a year or more old, right, and the appraised value is current.
Right. So it's for any renovation or market.
And that's the other reason. The other reason is and I say we as the OPA, may not be aware of any changes in the property, either positive or negative. The property may have gone from what we would rate as a typical average property to becoming vacant and vandalized.
Right.
We don't know that. Therefore, the value we have is for a average livable, habitable house, which is now vacant and vandalized shell. So obviously our number's too high.
Gotcha.
How do we know that? We need the appellate, or forgive me, the taxpayer, to inform us of that.
Right.
The other thing could be, we could have a value on a property that, as far as our records are concerned, is a typical average habitable house. And in the last couple of months, it's been totally rehabbed. Now it's worth 3 times more than what we have on it. We don't know that either, except we do because we have access to the permits.
Right.
If somebody does it via permits.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, is how does the office kind of like get caught up to speed, or how does it learn about what's happening inside properties? Mainly permitting? So
what happens is, generally on about a monthly basis, Department of License Inspections updates the OPA with all the permits that were filed that month. Mm-hmm. And then each individual assessor, and I think I said to you in a conversation, last time I checked, we had about 127 licensed assessors on staff. Yeah. And our entire office staff is a little over 200 support personnel. Each assessor who is assigned a different section of the city and different classifications of properties, so we're very compartmentalized, will review those permits to determine if they warrant a relook at the value. So if somebody installs a 100 amp electrical service via a permit, I'm not going to increase the value.
Right. Right.
However, if they put a $50,000 kitchen in, that's going to trigger a reassessment.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's those big significant changes that you're looking at, rather than like slow, like
somebody puts a new roof on, that's maintenance, not improvements.
Gotcha. Okay.
So the assessor looks at those permits, reviews them on a monthly basis, determines which ones would warrant a look for a potential assessment increase, and the ones that aren't, we just file them.
Okay, great. So I do want to talk about the appraisal process and the appeals process and everything. But before we get to that, just to kind of cover our bases in terms of what a developer needs to know about the appraised value, like on its face value, the assessed value. Like, what is it? We already covered how it relates to the taxation system of the property, your yearly tax balance. But like, what do they need to know in terms of calculating that value for the future? Like if they're looking at the appraised value of a potential project, let's say, and they're seeing they got an appraisal on the home of what it's going to be after they renovate or something, and then the assessed value is different, and they're expecting to be paying much, much lower taxes because that's what the assessed value is. And then that's what they're putting in their budget and thinking long-term. I guess like as a developer, you need to count up the small costs and everything. So should they feel confident that it's going to remain at that tax value, or should they be thinking that it's going to soon, should they be like planning for that increase in value?
Yes. I think it would be prudent for them to plan for the increase, especially since we now know that the assessor is provided with copies of all permits.
Right.
So assessors, if he's doing his or her job, they're going to review those permits and that will trigger a second look. So I think it would be prudent for a developer who is rehabbing or renovating a property to be aware that at some point the OPA is going to become aware of that.
Right. So you should.
It may take a year, but it's going to happen.
Okay? Right. Gotcha. So you shouldn't see a low assessed value and a high appraised value and think, oh, like I'm going to cheat taxes there. It's going to.
You might for a short amount of time.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Sorry, that was a long-winded question. I hope that made sense to you. The next thing I want to talk about is the actual appraisal process and how you or the assessing process, how you reach that value. We covered the appraisal process for the private side of things a couple of weeks ago on one of these jumpinars. And I want to ask you as a city assessor, well, what's your process?
Right. A colleague of mine, Felix Aguirre.
Yeah. That's right. So how does it work on the city side of things, and what's your strategy like?
So the goal is just like an appraiser. The OPA's goal is to provide a fair market value for every parcel in the city, just the same way as an appraiser would do, except on an extremely large mass basis. Mm-hmm. It's called modeling, but actually it uses a system which is called regression analysis.
Right.
Okay? That's not my department. We have a director for that, but I understand a little bit about how it works, but essentially it attempts for a computer and an algorithm, okay, to come as close as possible to determining values for 589,000 parcels of real estate and do it within a reasonably short amount of time, which is like a year. Okay. And it's done based, it's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. So we strive to populate the model with the most accurate, relevant market information possible. Mm-hmm. So it's just like an appraiser will get an assignment to appraise, keep it simple, a house, and it'll do market research. So we have all the various different departments doing market research based on wards. We call them wards, but they're sections of the city. Mm-hmm. And based on property type. So if it's a residential ward, sales data is being analyzed on sales of homes in that area. If it's a commercial retail property, we're looking at sales and leases of commercial retail properties. Right. So we're always striving to collect and acquire as much market data as possible because in the end, even though it might seem like that, the goal is the same as an appraiser.
If you're just tuning in, this is a conversation with Rob Luciani about the city's Office of Property Assessment, also called OPA. And thank you for listening to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show on Germantown Community Radio, WRGU 92.9 FM. I hope you're enjoying the discussion. Gotcha. So are any types of properties looked at on an individual basis, or are they all kind of looked at in a grander scheme?
On appeal.
On appeal. Okay. So maybe that's a good segue into talking about the appeal process.
The only ways we would look at an individual property is based on an appeal and or triggered by permits, significant permits. Mm-hmm. So we see when we get permits in for rehabbing, and there's going to be $200,000-$300,000 spent on a rehab. We're going to look at that. Mm-hmm. Other than that, no. So if someone never appeals and they never do a rehab project, their property will never be looked at individually. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, gotcha. So now, it seems natural segue into the appeal process, unless there's anything else you want to cover about the appraisal process. Otherwise, people can just go watch the Alec or Felix's Jumpinar. But why don't you tell me a little bit about the appeals process and what it's like here in Philly versus what other cities might experience?
There's a couple different levels for appeals. I have some some notes from a handout that I use when I do this live, as I told you about, right? So give me a second here.
Yeah, no, take it.
There's a couple different levels of appeal. The city does make an attempt to try to make the appeals process as fair and equitable as possible. It may not appear that way from the outside, but we do want people to have an opportunity to. It's a right, legal, constitutional right that taxpayers, property owners have to appeal their assessment if they have a basis.
Gotcha.
It's not just because, and sometimes we hear this, and I don't mean to be jovial about it, but something we hear, what's the basis for your appeal? My taxes are too high. That's not the basis.
The circular argument.
Yeah. It has to be some sort of factual, documentary evidence to show us, and we'll look at anything. We'll look at anything that an appellate has, and try to make a determination if it's legitimate.
Okay. Before we start the process here, I just want to remind everybody that we do have a Q&A session planned in probably about 10 minutes here once we wrap up our discussion. So be sure to enter those questions into the Q&A tab here on Zoom webinar, and we'll get to them in about 10 or 15 minutes. So what do you have for us, Rob?
Well, city tries to make it pretty painless, starting by not charging a fee. Okay, so that's an attempt to appear to be taxpayer friendly.
What is the fee like in other cities?
I've seen them as high as $200.
Okay,
they're usually not that egregious.
Yeah, I mean, well, that can make a difference in your budget. If you're crunching numbers, I'm sure. Especially
if it's a residential homeowner living in a neighborhood which is being gentrified,
right?
And they just, so there's programs for that. We have Loop and we have Homestead. You familiar with those programs?
I'm not actually. I think I've heard of Loop, but what do they do?
Well, Loop is long-time owner-occupied property. That's where we will take up a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood, and we will freeze their assessment for 10 years.
Gotcha.
So that they won't be priced out of their property by significant tax increases because of all the gentrification that's going on. So they're living in a typical row house in some neighborhood in Philadelphia, which was one time worth $50,000, and now it's worth $450,000, and they can't afford to.
And is that a program people would access through your office? Would they contact you?
Yeah. Okay. The OPA website.
Gotcha. Okay.
Everything's on the web now. It used to be people would come into the office, come to our CSC, customer service center, right. And come wait in line and apply but it's now done all.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good. I would be interested in having a discussion about that. Maybe that's a future jump in our topic about how people can preserve their longtime residences. That's good.
It's intended to not to price people out of their home via taxes.
Good.
And the same thing with Homestead.
Right.
And that's the same thing. That's where a flat amount, $45,000, is deducted from any person's assessment if it's your primary residence and you live there.
Okay. Wow.
So whatever you're assessed for, you apply. Once again, you apply online. Whatever you're assessed for, I have it at my house.
Nice. Cool.
Doesn't matter. You could be a millionaire. You live in a house in the city of Philadelphia, and you're a homeowner. You're entitled to the homestead exemption.
Okay. All right. So the appeals process, where do you start? If you check the website or you get a notice or something about what your home's assessed value is and you strongly disagree, we don't have to go into the many reasons why you might, but let's just say you have a strong basis to disagree. What do you do? What's your first step?
So I would recommend that they file what's called an FLR, first level review. It doesn't require a hearing. That's where the request goes directly to the assessor in that ward, in that district. And I know back in 2012, when we first started the revaluation process, which we hadn't done in a while, we got like 57,000 FLRs in 1 year because it was easy to do when we first started the FLR process. Anyway, long story short, It doesn't require an appearance. It doesn't require an appraisal. It's simply saying, hey, Mr. Assessor, would you take another look at my number because I think it's too high? Now, you do have to provide some sort of documentation about why it's too high. Give us a reason. Why is it too high? Well, the house across the street just sold, and it sold for a lot less than mine. Well, when we look at it, we find out that, your house is 3,000 square feet and that one's 1,000 square feet. So of course it's going to sell for less.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, if they have a reason.
How in detail do you have to be in that writing? Is it just a couple sentences or?
It's really informal. Most people write them in their handwriting.
There you go. All right.
And they fax it in or email it in, or they'll do it online. They could print out the application, fill it out, email it back. It's very informal. And I got to tell you, the more informal it is, the less likely you're going to be granted a reduction, because we have to have something to hang our hat on.
Right.
As an assessor, which is, I don't necessarily do this in my daily routine anymore, but over the years I've done them. If I'm going to agree to lower someone's assessment, I better have documentation for that. Otherwise, whoever my supervisor is at the time will question, why'd you lower that assessment? What was your authority? What was your basis? Oh, because the people said they couldn't afford to tax anymore. Well, I'm going to get in trouble.
So let's say, what would you say? How many out of 10 cases do you think get solved in that first level appeal or first level?
A lot do, because many people unfortunately do not have sufficient documentation.
Okay.
And so they're denied, and then they're told they can go to the next level. Doesn't prevent them. They can file a regular appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Which again, they could request non-hearing, or in this one, they could either request to have a hearing or a non-hearing.
Okay.
And then that becomes a formal appeal.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's looked at again.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully there's some documentation. Sometimes if I get an opportunity to speak to a taxpayer, I'll say, look, you're not required to have an appraisal. By the way, the city only requires an appraisal if the value is over $1 million.
Okay.
You are required to have some kind of evidence. So go to your local realtor's office, get some printouts of some comparable sales, go to Zillow, go to Redfin, take
Mm-hmm.
pictures. If you're saying your house is overassessed, let's see what it looks like. Let us in the house,
Mm-hmm.
which more often than not, folks don't want to let us in because they think that's going to be disadvantageous to them. And it's not, especially if their home is in need of repair.
Yeah.
It's to their advantage to allow us.
So it sounds like there's some things that you can do to kind of like help ease that process a little bit. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's all about, if you have some kind of documentation from any source, the local real estate office, like I said, Redfin, Zillow, anything. We look at everything and anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to sift through it. And sometimes folks do send in photographs. I can recall when I was doing that kind of assessor work, we'd often get a lot of photographs. Of course, the ones that showed the holes in the ceilings and the roof leaking and stuff like that. And that's okay. If that's true, then it's a basis for a reduction.
Gotcha. Now, do people ever try to make the claim that they should be like reimbursed for the taxes that they paid while the appeal process was going on, or anything like that? Or is it understood that as soon as the assessed value is reconsidered or it updates, that's when they'll begin paying the updated tax rate?
To my knowledge, they don't get reimbursed. If that were to happen, it goes to the Department of Revenue.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't come from the OPA. We don't deal in any kind of money at all. We don't collect money. We don't send bills out. We send notices, as you know, assessment notices.
Right.
So I really don't know, to be honest with you, Derek. I guess it's possible that if someone has paid a significant amount of money overage in taxes, I'm pretty sure that I have heard some stories around the office where significant refunds were provided to large commercial buildings that were overassessed in the millions.
Gotcha.
So yes, I believe they would be entitled to a refund.
Okay. So the last thing I want to ask about is abatement, because that's something you mentioned as another process you want to describe.
Yeah.
Unless there's anything to cover with appeals, or do you feel like?
Well, the important thing about appeals is that it's available. It is the recourse. It's not about we're doing anyone a favor. It's your legal right.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're required by law to look at appeals. That's part of what we do. So, and there's a couple different levels. The first level review is the first one. Then it can go to an appeal with not having to come in, because some people might say, I don't want to go in for a hearing, so we'll look at it without a hearing. We'll look at it with the hearing. Then it can go to the Court of Common Pleas, which usually is for larger commercial properties. But, that's the recourse. So when someone gets an assessment notice and they believe it's too high and they have documentation to prove that it's too high, they absolutely should file an appeal. That's your legal right.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's the best thing I could say. And you don't need to be represented by a lawyer or a CPA. You don't need an appraisal unless the value of the property is over $1 million. I recommend sometimes to people they should get an appraisal, because that does a lot of talking. If someone hands us a certified appraisal, we're going to look at that with a lot more credibility than them handing us a couple of printouts from an MLS.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like they're doing their work for you. They're doing your work for you. They're helping you.
Now they're going to have to pay for that appraisal. It's going to cost them $300, $400, $500, $600. So they have to decide whether or not that's worth it. But they don't have to have an appraisal.
Sure. Okay.
And so it's the city. It's not the OPA necessarily, but the city in general tries to make the process as taxpayer friendly as possible. That's about the best thing I can say.
All right, got it. So that covers appeals. Now, what about abatements?
Well, so that would relate a lot to what your folks are doing, of course. Okay, because if anyone doesn't understand what abatement means, it simply means that it's the city's attempt to promote development and regentrification.
Right.
Okay, so the city essentially says, hey, you potential developers, builders, whatever, if you'll go through the, and of course, for a profit, the city doesn't have any limitation on what kind of profit you make, but if you'll do the process of gentrifying the city for your effort, we will abate the real estate taxes for up to 10 years. And that's been bantered around city council for the past probably 5 years or more about reducing that. Last I heard, it's still at 10 years. Okay. And so sometimes the confusing part about that is that the land assessment does not get abated, only the improvements or the building.
Okay.
The property is assessed, just use round numbers, for $200,000, and the land is assessed for $50,000, and the building is assessed for $150,000. The $150,000 will be abated. The property owner will still pay tax on the $50,000 land.
Gotcha.
But that's a significant abatement.
Okay.
So there's always going to be tax. It'll just be on the land. Now, there's partial abatements depending on circumstances. We have rehab abatements. We have new construction abatements. There's a couple different classifications, but essentially that's what it is. Okay. The value of the improvements, as we say, are abated.
Okay. Gotcha. Makes sense to me. So we're right about here at 7:40, and we have a couple questions that came through. So is there any closing points you want to make here, Rob, or otherwise we can move on to the Q&A?
Well, yeah, abatements are important for developers like your folks, because it would be a good marketing tool. Right. A lot of builders and renovators and folks that do the stuff that you folks do can say, well, if you buy this property after I renovate it, you'll pay no tax on the building for 10 years. You'll pay it on the land, which is significantly less. Okay. Right. But you won't pay it on the building. So we have seen that it's a good marketing tool.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah.
To be able to offer. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what is that? Do they go through your office, or what's the process?
Yeah. The abatements I don't work in that department. We have an abatement department and an exemptions department.
Gotcha.
And so you would file applications for the various abatements, depending on, well, for example, there's new construction. That means it's ground up, brand new. There's rehab. There's a developer's abatement. There's an end user homeowner abatement. There's abatements for commercial industrial properties. There's all different kinds, but I'm sure they're all accessible on the website.
And that concludes my conversation with Rob Luciani, who works for the Office of Property Assessment, also called OPA. about what the assessed value of your home means and what the appeals and abatement processes look like. The interviews on this program are recorded during Jumpstart Germantown's weekly Jump&R series, which takes place via Zoom webinar every Monday night at 7 p.m. If you'd like to participate in the live Q&A with our guest, be sure to head to jumpstartgermantown.com/events and register for next week's Jump&R. If you're interested in starting a Jumpstart program in your own community, visit gojumpstart.org and see our how-to guide and open source training workbook. Thanks so much for listening to the Jumpstart Philly Real Estate Radio Show on Germantown Community Radio, WRGU 92.9 FM, and be sure to tune in next week.